History is filled with stories of kings who died on the battlefield, were struck down by assassins, or wasted away in their palaces. But there exists a far more chilling tale of a king not slain by sword, but slowly suffocated beneath the earth, buried alive by the very court that once bowed before him. It is a story so grotesque that many dismissed it as legend, yet the evidence suggests otherwise. In the ancient world, kingship was not merely power, it was survival. A ruler's throne was secured not only by armies, but by loyalty, fear, and the cunning of those who surrounded him. Courts were dens of ambition, where advisors smiled by day and plotted by night. A single misstep could transform subjects into executioners. This was the reality faced by King Sancho II of Castile in the 13th century, by the Persian monarchs before him, and by countless rulers. Whispered about in chronicles, men whose final punishment was entombment while still breathing. To bury a man alive was not an ordinary execution. It was a sentence reserved for betrayal, heresy, or the kind of hatred that demanded suffering, not mercy. In Rome, Vestal virgins who broke their vows were sealed into chambers beneath the earth, with only a small lamp and a loaf of bread, left to suffocate in silence. Among medieval courts, rivals could be walled up inside castles, their screams muffled behind stone. For kings, however, such a fate was almost unthinkable. To condemn a sovereign to such a death meant the court itself had turned executioner, stripping away the sacred veil of monarchy. The story of the king buried alive begins not with his enemies, but with his own allies. Chroniclers wrote that he ruled poorly, ignoring counsel, quarreling with nobles, and draining treasuries for endless wars. Discontent festered. Ministers whispered that the king had lost the favor of both God and man. At first, the court plotted quietly, waiting for weakness. But as famine and rebellion spread, the whispers hardened into resolve. Their sovereign must be removed. And so, the stage was set not for an assassination by dagger, nor for poison slipped into a goblet, but for a punishment both symbolic and terrifying. To bury the king alive was to erase him not only from the throne, but from memory, to silence him beneath the very earth he once ruled. Yet before we descend into the soil of betrayal, we must understand the king himself. Who was he? How did his rule collapse so completely that those closest to him chose such a monstrous fate? The answer begins with his reign, a time of rising ambition and fatal blindness. Every tragic downfall begins with a moment of triumph. For the king who would one day be buried alive, his early reign appeared to promise stability and power. He had inherited his throne not as a usurper, but as the rightful heir, blessed by lineage, crowned with ceremony, and sworn loyalty by his nobles. Yet what begins with gold and incense can quickly decay into ashes. Chroniclers describe him as ambitious, eager to expand his realm and secure his legacy. At first, the people admired his energy. He rode at the head of his armies, presided over courts with stern authority, and promised prosperity through conquest. But ambition is a double-edged sword. His military campaigns drained treasuries and cost countless lives. Taxes rose steeply to pay for wars that yielded little gain. Soldiers returned maimed, villages emptied, and famine spread in the wake of destruction. At court, his relationship with the nobility began to fracture. Kings relied on their lords for armies, coin, and support, but this king treated his allies more like servants. Where advisors offered counsel, he dismissed them as cowards. When nobles withheld funds, he seized estates and executed rivals. Such displays of cruelty bred silence in the court, but also simmering resentment. Worse still, he quarreled with the church. In medieval kingdoms, the blessing of priests was as vital as the strength of soldiers. Without divine legitimacy, a ruler stood on sand. Yet the king openly defied bishops, seized church lands, and imposed taxes on clergy. To his people, it seemed their ruler was not only failing them, but defying heaven itself. The cracks widened when famine struck, crops failed, and markets emptied. While peasants starved, the king continued to spend lavishly on feasts and hunts, further alienating his subjects. Rumors whispered that God had cursed his rule, or once the people had cheered him, they now cursed his name in the streets. Still, he clung to power. The crown was heavy, but he wore it with stubborn pride. He believed himself invincible, guarded by tradition and fear. But he overlooked the truth of monarchies. Kings do not rule alone. They survive only so long as their court allows it. Behind the glittering halls of his palace, men plotted. Nobles who had once bent the knee now conspired to break him. Advisors who once flattered him sharpened plans as carefully as blades. They would not risk open rebellion, for the king still had soldiers. Instead, they whispered of a punishment more terrible than the sword of fate that would end not only his reign, but his very memory. The king, blinded by arrogance, never saw the trap tightening. His court still smiled before him, but beneath those smiles lay the cold patience of men preparing a tomb. But how did whispers turn to action? What final act convinced his court that the time had come to strike against their sovereign? Every betrayal starts with silence, the moment when advisors stop warning and nobles stop protesting. For the doomed king, that silence was already heavy in his court. Behind jeweled smiles and bowed heads, resentment grew sharper than steel. The court no longer asked how long he would reign, but how best to end him. The king's last years were marked by rash decisions. He demanded more taxes to fund a war that his generals begged him to abandon. He dismissed advisors for questioning his judgment. He punished nobles by confiscating their lands, redistributing them to favorites who lacked influence. In doing so, he fractured the balance of power that had held his throne together. Rebellion flared across his territories. Villages refused to pay taxes. Soldiers deserted to join bandits. Even the church denounced him, calling his policies tyrannical. Yet the king refused to bend. He thundered that his crown was God's will, that no man could challenge his rule. In truth, he had already lost the one thing every king required: trust. The conspirators in his court did not strike all at once. They whispered, plotted, and watched. They counted allies carefully, for open rebellion against a king was treason, punishable by death. But as famine deepened and soldiers deserted, their confidence grew. One by one, the nobles pledged to act. What drove them to such an unthinkable punishment? Chronicles hint at both hatred and fear. Killing a king outright by sword or poison might make him a martyr, remembered with sympathy. But to bury him alive was to erase him. It was a sentence that turned a sovereign into a criminal, as if the earth itself had rejected his reign. The plan was whispered in secret: lure the king away from his guards, capture him swiftly, and carry him not to a battlefield or prison, but to a prepared grave. This would not be a public execution, for the people might revolt. Instead, it would be carried out in shadows known only to those who plotted it. Whispered in chronicles centuries later, the betrayal began with false assurances. Courtiers flattered him, urging him to attend private councils, to trust their loyalty. He accepted, blind to the daggers behind their words. The king, so convinced of his divine right, could not imagine his court turning against him. Yet as he walked among them, his fate was sealed. When the trap was finally sprung, he had no time to rally soldiers or summon allies. His guards were bribed or silenced. His closest advisors turned their backs. The king found himself bound, his cries echoing not in a throne room, but in a dark chamber where spades of earth had already been prepared. The betrayal was complete. But what followed was worse than death itself: the slow, suffocating horror of being buried alive. No sword struck him down. No poison ended his breath. Instead, the king was dragged from his chamber in the dead of night, bound hand and foot, and carried to a pit dug in secret. Some accounts describe it as a shallow grave in the palace gardens, others as a stone chamber beneath the earth. What they all agree upon is this: it was not the grave of a king, but the trap of an outcast. The conspirators moved quickly, fearful that loyalists might discover them. Torches burned low, casting the king's terrified face in flickering light. He screamed curses, invoked the gods, and swore revenge from beyond the grave. But his words only echoed against stone and soil. For the first time in his reign, his voice held no command. The nobles who carried out the act did not strike him with mercy. They did not allow him a final prayer or ritual. They bound his mouth with cloth to silence his cries and lowered him into the pit. Then came the sound, the dull final thud of earth falling over flesh. One shovelful, then another. Imagine the horror, the weight of soil pressing down, the air growing thin, the torchlight above shrinking to a single crack before vanishing into darkness. Buried alive, He could feel his body crushed beneath the earth, his lungs fighting for every desperate gasp. Each breath grew shallower until all that remained was silence. To the conspirators, this method was deliberate. They wanted him harassed, not just dethroned, not merely killed, but humiliated. To be buried alive was the death of criminals, traitors, or the cursed. It was punishment without honor, a death that left no body to display, no tomb to mourn. For a king who once demanded monuments, there would be no grave for loyalists to gather around. The court moved swiftly to erase his memory. They spread word that the king had died of illness, or that he had vanished mysteriously, depending on the chronicle. His name was stricken from prayers, his coins melted down, his statues pulled from temples. The man who once declared himself divinely chosen was reduced to nothing but whispers. Yet the earth does not keep secrets forever. Centuries later, chroniclers recorded the rumor that he had been buried alive by his own court. Some dismissed it as legend, a tale told to frighten future kings. Others swore it was truth, citing forgotten documents and testimonies that slipped through the cracks of censorship. The horror of his death still lingers, because it forces a haunting question. What crime could justify burying a king alive? Was he truly a tyrant so cruel that even his nobles sought such an end? Or was his fate the ultimate betrayal, a crime disguised as justice? The living tomb swallowed him whole, but the memory of his suffocating end would live far longer than his reign. When the earth closed over the king, the court knew they had to act fast. A buried body might stay hidden, but suspicion would not. The people would ask questions, foreign allies would demand answers, and loyal soldiers, if they sensed betrayal, could plunge the entire kingdom into civil war. The solution was deception. The conspirators spread word that the king had fallen ill. Some versions say they claimed he died of a fever, others that he suffered a sudden seizure in the night. A royal physician, either coerced or complicit, was forced to sign off on the lie. A false burial was staged, complete with an empty coffin sealed in a public tomb. Priests conducted the rites, chanting prayers over nothing but air. To the people, the king had been given a proper farewell. Inside the palace, the truth was kept under lock and key. Servants who whispered about screams in the night disappeared. Guards who asked why they were not summoned for duty that evening were reassigned or executed. The court was scrubbed of evidence, and silence became the law. But covering up such a crime is never perfect. Rumors began to spread in hushed tones through the marketplace. "Did you hear?" some asked. "The king did not die. They say he was buried alive." Others swore they heard muffled cries beneath the earth, or saw soil disturbed, where none should have been. Fear sharpened the whispers, and soon the streets buzzed with uneasy speculation. The nobles responded with violence. Anyone caught spreading the rumor was beaten or imprisoned. Scribes who dared to write down the story had their work destroyed. Still, the truth clung to the air like smoke impossible to contain. The harsher the punishment, the stronger the belief that something terrible had been hidden. The cover-up also required a new ruler. Without one, the deception would collapse. The nobles hastily installed a successor, someone pliable, someone who owed their throne to those who orchestrated the burial. This new monarch wasted no time rewarding the conspirators with wealth and power. But the shadow of their crime hung heavy over the palace. Every feast, every speech, every ritual was tainted by the knowledge that the crown sat on a throne built over the bones of betrayal. For the people, doubt began to take root. If a king could be buried alive by his own court, what did that say about the sanctity of monarchy, about the supposed divine bond between ruler and ruled? Some whispered that the gods themselves had turned their backs on the dynasty, allowing such horror to unfold. The more the court tried to bury the truth, the deeper it spread into legend. It would outlive them all. Time is the enemy of secrets. What was once whispered in fear began to resurface in chronicles, plays, and even songs. The story of the king buried alive took on a life of its own, mutating as it passed from mouth to mouth. For some, it was told as a warning against tyranny. For others, it became a parable of betrayal, proof that no throne is safe when trust is broken. Chroniclers who lived long after the event argued bitterly over what had happened. Some swore it was fact, pointing to fragments of lost letters and hidden testimonies. Others dismissed it as myth, invented by political rivals to smear a fallen dynasty. But the very persistence of the tale suggests it carried weight and echo of something too monstrous to be entirely false. The legend grew darker with each retelling. In one version, the king clawed at the earth so desperately that his fingers bled and his nails cracked. His cries muffled until his throat tore. In another, priests later confessed that they felt tremors in the ground during his staged funeral, as though the earth itself rejected the lie. Still others claimed that the soil above his body never settled, shifting restlessly as if the dead king still struggled below. The image of a monarch suffocating under dirt struck a chord across generations. It inverted the very idea of kingship. A king was meant to rise above all others, immortalized in stone and bronze, praised in temples and remembered in song. But this king was forced into the earth while still alive, treated not as a ruler, but as something unworthy of even a clean death. Said the story took root in folklore. Parents whispered it to their children at night. Do not be cruel, for even kings can be dragged into the ground. Street performers dramatized it in markets, their voices rising as they mimicked the king's desperate gasps. Priests, too, seized upon it, using the tale as proof that divine punishment awaited even the mightiest when corruption ruled their hearts. But as the story spread, it also blurred. Was the king truly a tyrant deserving of such an end? Or had his court condemned him unjustly to seize power for themselves? Some saw him as a monster destroyed by justice, others as a victim crushed by betrayal. The truth became less important than the lesson people drew from it. Power can never guarantee safety. The legend ensured that, though his name might be erased from monuments, his story would never vanish. His living tomb became more famous than his reign, a chilling reminder that no throne is immune to the weight of soil and silence. Yet legends have consequences, and in the centuries that followed, his death would be used not just to frighten children, but to challenge kings themselves. The story of the king buried alive did not die with him, became a shadow that haunted palaces across the ancient world. When rulers heard the whispers of how a throne could crumble overnight, they did not dismiss them. They tightened their guard, expanded their networks of spies, and punished even the faintest hint of disloyalty. Yet the fear lingered because, if it could happen once, it could happen again. Some monarchs went to obsessive lengths to avoid his fate. In certain kingdoms, rulers began sleeping in chambers, guarded by soldiers who had sworn oaths sealed with blood. Food tasters became more common, and burial rituals were revised to ensure no ruler could ever be hidden alive in the earth again. Kings demanded their bodies be displayed publicly upon death, as if daring their enemies to challenge the truth. Historians have recorded strange accounts of rulers who spoke of their fear openly. One North African king is said to have ordered his servants to leave his tomb unsealed for 7 days, just in case he was not truly dead. Another in Eastern Europe demanded that his heirs burn his body at once upon his final breath. Refusing to risk the humiliation of being swallowed by the soil like the buried king, the legend also shaped politics. Courtiers understood that kings were paranoid, and some exploited this fear. Rumors of plots, whether real or fabricated, were enough to trigger purges. Entire families were wiped out because a monarch feared suffering the same betrayal. The soil that smothered one king continued to choke generations of rulers long after. But there was another side to the fear. Some saw in the tale not a warning against betrayal, but an opportunity. The buried king's death became proof that kings could be brought down. Secret societies and rebellious nobles carried the story with them like a weapon. A reminder that no matter how divine or absolute rulers claimed to be, their lives could be taken in silence, buried beneath dirt and lies. Even outside royal courts, ordinary people clung to the story. Farmers, merchants, and soldiers alike passed it down as proof that fate catches up with all men, whether peasant or king. It became a leveling tale, stripping away the aura of immortality that monarchs tried so hard to maintain. The buried king's shadow stretched far beyond his lifetime. His story unsettled rulers for centuries, forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth: power rests not only on armies and crowns, but on fragile trust. And when that trust cracks, a throne can become a coffin. Yet while many kings trembled at the thought, there were others who embraced cruelty as if to prove they were untouchable. And in their arrogance they paved the way for new horror's echoes of the same betrayal that once sealed a king beneath the earth. The burial of a king alive may sound unique, but history is riddled with rulers who met fates just as cruel at the hands of their own courts. Betrayal has always been the shadow that walks alongside power. The story of the buried king was not an isolated horror, it was part of a much larger pattern of rulers undone, not by foreign enemies, but by those closest to them. In Byzantium, emperors were often blinded, castrated, or imprisoned by their own advisors and kin. Court conspiracies thrived in the glittering palaces of Constantinople, where a single whisper could topple a dynasty. In Persia, kings who lost favor were suffocated with curtains of death, designed to leave no marks. A silent execution carried out behind palace walls. The Mongol Khans were not immune either. In their courts, betrayal often came suddenly, delivered with poisoned wine or a blade in the night. Even the mighty Genghis Khan left behind heirs who would battle each other, their courts soaked in treachery as brothers turned on brothers. Europe, too, offers chilling echoes. In medieval castles, kings who trusted too freely were locked away in towers by their own nobles. Some were starved to death. Others mysteriously fell ill, just as their enemies rose in power. And still, the legend of the king buried alive stood apart, carried a visceral image that no other execution could match. What made the tale unforgettable was not simply that a monarch was killed. It was that he was entombed while his heart still beat, denied both dignity and mercy. His betrayal was not swift, but suffocating, carried out grain by grain of earth, each handful sealing his fate, while his court stood by. In every retelling across cultures, the story resonated because it tapped into a universal fear: the betrayal of trust. A king relies on his court just as a man relies on his friends or family. But when loyalty shatters, the downfall is more brutal than any enemy could deliver. This is why echoes of the buried king's fate can be found not just in chronicles, but in literature, theater, and folklore. Shakespearean tragedies would later echo similar themes of rulers betrayed in their moment of greatest need. Folk songs in villages carried verses of kings undone by treachery, a reminder that no crown could protect against the knife hidden in the hand of a friend. The echoes prove a haunting truth: betrayal is timeless. And though the buried king may have been just one man, his story became a mirror for countless others who learned too late that power built on fear and suspicion cannot hold. But while his tale spread far, the true horror lay not in its retellings, but in what his death revealed about the fragile nature of Rulan, how even in silence a king's last breath can change the course of history. Centuries may pass, but some stories cling to humanity's memory with iron chains. The king who is buried alive remains one such story, a legend that continues to disturb, because it forces us to confront the ugliest side of power. His legacy was not written in stone monuments or victorious battles. It was written in soil, in the suffocating silence of betrayal, and in the whispers that refused to die. For later generations, the tale became more than a curiosity, it became a warning. Historians argued over its details, skeptics questioned its truth, but none could deny its impact. The idea of a ruler dying not on the battlefield, but under the weight of his own court's treachery, spoke to something universal. It stripped away the illusion of kingship as divine and untouchable. It showed that no crown could protect against human fear, greed, and ambition. The story's endurance lies in its imagery. A king clawing at the dirt, lungs burning, heart pounding. Although sworn to protect him, shovel the very earth that dooms him, this is not just a political act. It is theater, ritual, and punishment, all in one. It horrifies because it is both intimate and public, a secret execution that became an eternal symbol. And yet, the tale also carries questions that will never be answered. Did the king deserve his fate, as his enemies claimed? Was he a tyrant whose cruelty drove even his most loyal subjects to rebel? Or was he the victim of ambition, silent so others could seize the throne? The soil hides the truth as well as the body, and history, once buried, is rarely unearthed whole. But perhaps the exact details no longer matter. What matters is what the story reveals: the fragility of power, the dangers of blind trust, and the price of betrayal. Kings across history trembled at the thought of his fate. Ordinary people saw in it a reminder that even the mighty fall. And for us today, It lingers as a chilling glimpse into the cruelty humans are capable of when ambition outweighs loyalty. In the end, his tomb was not sealed with stone, but with legend. He lives on, not as a ruler remembered for laws or victories, but as a man consumed by the soil of his own court's treachery. His throne became a grave, his crown a curse, his name a whisper. And so, the story endures. The king who did not die in battle, who was not struck by the hand of an enemy, but who was buried alive by those he trusted most. A reminder that in history, the darkest truths are not always found in the wars we fight against strangers, but in the betrayals we suffer at the hands of those closest to us.